About 8, maybe 10 years ago, I started messing around with mushrooms and trying to grow them various ways. And I managed to grow some really beautiful, giant, juicy oyster mushrooms outdoors in a tray of straw. And I thought, well, gee, that was easy. I'm going to do that again. Needless to say, the next time I tried doing that, it did not go the way I had planned, didn't go very well at all. I spent another 6 years doing all sorts of experimentation, culturing mushrooms and spawn, making my own spawn, trying different substrates, growing in different types of containers, and eventually, after all of that, I got to the point where I could reliably grow mushrooms outdoors in my backyard. This wouldn't be much of an achievement if I lived in Seattle, but I'm in the high desert at about 5,000 feet in a very arid environment. The winters here are pretty cold, it snows a lot, the summers are hot, and we've been in a drought for a while, so rain is not necessarily guaranteed or even frequent. There's only a short section of the summertime where it typically rains, so growing mushrooms in an environment like that presented a bit of a challenge. This video is not about how I did that. This video is how I dealt with the giant pile of straw in my backyard, which was left over from growing pounds and pounds of mushrooms. This is the source of my problem. This is where I dumped all the spent sawdust and straw and various materials that I grew the mushrooms on. I dumped it out there last fall when it got cold and didn't touch it much since, other than giving it some water now and then. It's well colonized. You can see big chunks of mycelium in there, growing through the sawdust, binding it together. The top is not very well broken down, but underneath, during the winter and the wet snow and rain, it did break down a bit. So I'm going to start going through this pile, and I'm going to pull off and separate out the different grades of material. The mycelium impregnated straw, that's good stuff. There's some dark, well digested material chock full of worms underneath it. And then there's a bunch of stuff that was on top, didn't get very wet. There's some weeds, branches, twigs, and general debris up there you can see at the top, which I need to hide somehow and get rid of it for a year or two so I don't have to deal with it. I'm digging in here looking for worms, see how many are down there, and sure enough I found them. Here they are. You can see them crawling around in there if I wasn't just moving around too fast, but trust me, there are a lot of worms in there. They love the mycelium. Worms can't eat straw, but mycelium can eat straw and worms can eat mycelium, so it's like web of life stuff where the fungus is breaking it down. It's providing food for not only worms but plants and bacteria and all the different things out there that have no hope in hell of being able to eat straw and sawdust. So I'm going to shovel all the good stuff up. I'm going to put that into a high dollar area of the garden, and then I'm going to separate out all that nasty brush weedy stuff, which normally people might put that in the trash. I'm going to use it and make it disappear for a few years, and by the time this is done and I dig that back out, you're going to think it's soil. One of my goals is to discard as little material as possible. So as a general rule of thumb, unless it's like toxic waste, it goes back into the backyard and gets recycled and run back into the soil. I did make an exception for that with the datura plant. It had grown very large before it died and dried out, about 13 feet across, and it was spiky and nasty and smelly. I like datura. It's a cool looking plant. It has beautiful flowers. It scares away a lot of pests in the garden, and maybe even some little kids sometimes. But there's a certain point when datura becomes counterproductive. That went in the trash. The rest of this stuff here, you can see a bunch of real brushy type stuff. This didn't get processed, but I've got a way of getting rid of it and actually putting it to good use. Sometimes I'll even go sneak over and steal the neighbor's weeds and haul them back and use them up. Anything I can get a hold of. I'd poop in my backyard if I could, but there are obvious logistical issues to that. It would probably do wonders for the soil, however. There are countries where they do that. This is actually one of them. Some of the raw sewage gets processed and sold as some very expensive fertilizer, but don't poop in your yard unless you know exactly what you're doing with that, because there are some risks. So this is one of the beds I started a year ago or so. It's gotten built up a bit. I gotta dig some rocks out of there and some other stuff. It's still kind of a rough area, but I'm digging down into the better soil, mixing it, and then I'm going to add the material I pulled out of the mycelium pile, and I'm going to mix that in with the good dirt and cut it 50-50 or 60-40, and use that to free up a little bit of good topsoil that I can use at some other areas of the garden and use it to expand the garden out. There are a lot of plants that don't take much soil to grow. Basil, for example, if you don't need it to get really big, you can grow that in as little as 4 inches of soil. Some of the herbs and small stuff, you might be able to do radishes or some things, will tolerate relatively thin topsoil. So by pulling soil and moving it around, remixing it, one of the things I'm doing here is I'm increasing the square footage of my garden. I can't really easily increase the amount of good soil I've got, but I can improve how it's utilized and try and get as much square footage as possible to take advantage of the sun. I'm adding some other adulterants in there. This is some gypsum. This would be a good time to add in manure and various things like that if I were like not so cheap that I didn't want to buy any and typically just get it from the woods. So mix this in, stir it around, maybe come back later and add some fish emulsion and some stuff like that for nitrogen. The soil here is very basic, so I need to probably work on kicking the pH down a bit, getting it more acidic, get some sulfur compounds in there, stuff like that, and keep adjusting that year after year, because the pH will tend to raise back up given time. Plants here seem to be happy with it, so it's not a huge issue. But I'm going to get about half of the dirt that was in there, or at least the good topsoil. I'm going to be able to take that out and use it other areas like those smart pots you see right behind me. Now, on the subject of manure, a lot of people get the stuff in the bag. I don't know if it's called Cow King or Happy Cow or Fat Cow or Flatulent Cow or Super Cow, something like that. That stuff seems to be more of whatever they scrape off the bottom of a feedlot as opposed to manure. So true manure is found out in the woods or the range, and it's usually in a round cow pie form that's been sitting out in the rain getting leached for a while. That makes the best gardening amendment as far as manure goes. What I'll do is I'll take that, gather it up, haul it back in the truck, and put that into a 55-gallon drum and add water to it. And then I'll take a shovel and a couple other big tools and chop on it for a week or two and chop it down and mix it into kind of a very thick slurry that smells bad. And I'll take that, dry it back out in a smart pot, and then toss it into the garden and work that in. The reason that I think this stuff is a lot better than that bag stuff is because mycelium doesn't want to grow on the bag stuff. It won't seem to want to touch that at all. The regular cow pie manure, the mycelium loves. It'll go through there and colonize it. In fact, a lot of times when I find it out in the field, it'll actually have other species of fungus growing in it. You'll see big chunks of mycelium. Sometimes you'll even see mushrooms growing in there, a couple different forms, or I believe what they call a fire fang. That tells you that it's actually something good. The mycelium likes it, it can eat it, it can break it down, and it can turn it into something that your plants like, or you can use it to actually grow mushrooms, which I've done in the past and works pretty well. So I'm just about done with this. Mix it, and then I'm going to move on to the next section and repeat the process, and then I'm going to think about whether or not I want to go over and get some fish emulsion and some other stuff to add in there and kick the nitrogen up a little bit and maybe get it ready for planting, which is probably coming in the next week or two as far as the tomatoes are concerned. So here I'm taking all of the brushy stuff, the stuff on the top of the pile that didn't break down very well, weeds, things I want to get rid of, things I don't want to see anytime soon. I'm putting all this into the smart pots for transportation. Smart pots are great for all sorts of things, for storing yard waste, hauling things around the yard, composting, straining. Got 1,000 uses. They're relatively inexpensive, and they're one of my favorite garden tools. They last for a number of years. It really depends on how they're treated, what you do with them. Growing fungus in them, the fungus tends to be pretty rough on them, and interestingly it'll grow right straight through them in some cases. But smart pots are great. I highly recommend them. So I gathered up all the debris and stuff that I didn't want to see for a while, put it into the smart pots, hauled it to the other side of the yard, and now I'm dumping it into one of the 150-gallon pots that last year was chock full of mycelium, and you can actually see the white mycelium left over and stuck to the outside of the pot. Most of the pots have that white stuff on there. That's mycelium. In a few cases it might be some water deposits, but most of it's mycelium. And I'm spreading this pot out and using the debris to inflate it. That pot holding 150 gallons is a lot bigger than I would possibly ever want to grow anything in. You could probably grow a 20-foot tree in that thing or bigger. So it's way overkill for a garden bed, but it's great for storing debris. So I'll go and open it up further and mix all that stuff out. This is not something that a plant's gonna eat. Fungus can eat it, and at this point there's a lot of fungus in there, and because this is a smart pot and it's made out of fabric, there's going to be some oxygen coming in, so there's a good chance that some of that fungus is actually going to be able to survive in there long term, despite what I'm about to do to it next. So I'm just getting it worked out to open it up and inflate it like a big hot air balloon or something. And now I'm going to take some of that nice mulch out of the bottom of the pile, and I'm going to start adding that on top. And then I'm going to mix in some regular topsoil and more mulch and topsoil. We just dump the whole thing in there, worms and all. And this way I basically don't have giant piles of compost sitting around the yard. Yard's nice and clean, but it has some other advantages in that once it's in this pot, I'm going to put dirt on top of it and actually turn this into a growing area, and every time I water the plants I'm also going to be watering the compost underneath. So I'll try and run this pot for a few years this way. Eventually the fabric will start to break down and it'll split, but by the time that happens I'm hoping that all this stuff will have turned to compost, and I'll be able to turn that back into the garden and put it in other smart pots and use it to further expand my garden. Yeah, this is a lot of work. The area that I'm digging topsoil out of last year wasn't horribly productive. Couple reasons for that. It doesn't get a full day of sun. You got some telephone poles there blocking sun, there's a shed on the other side blocking sun, and the other reason was there was a giant datura plant growing there that I didn't have the heart to kill, and it kind of took up about 15 feet of that bed by the time the season was over. I did get a really good spiky datura berry harvest, not that I can actually do anything with those. The datura plants do seem to scare grasshoppers though, and some other bugs, so that's good, and they have flowers. You don't want to eat them. You don't eat the datura. Bad datura. Bad things happen if you eat the datura. It does have its medicinal usages and like creams and stuff like that though. So now I'm finishing off this bed, adding a little more soil. It's maybe close to a foot or so deep there. I've folded some of the smart pot down and around, and then just push that back with the dirt because I didn't want to fill it up even further. And then I'm going to rake this and level it out, and I've added some gypsum to it and some ash and a few things like that. And now the important part, got to water it the first time. And what I'm doing here is I'm actually also leveling this. So I'm getting it wet, I'm soaking it, and I'm blasting the heck out of it with water. And this is going to create a slurry and basically liquefy the entire top. And I'll run it around the edge. This will help settle the soil down and compress it a little bit, where because it's still pretty fluffy with all that weedy stuff underneath it. And I'm just going around and around and around, shooting that jet of water right straight into the soil. If I were planting seeds, depending on the seeds, I might put them in at this point and actually use that to blast the seeds into the soil and mix them. And I typically do this if it were basil or dill or chard or something where I was basically just growing a dense field of plants in there. Obviously wouldn't work well with tomato seeds or a bigger plant like that. So I'm adding water, mixing, and just stirring this stuff up and liquefying the whole top of the pot in the mud. And you'll be surprised how fast this actually dries out. This will solidify in about 10 minutes after I've watered it. You want to start watering your pots before you plant sometimes too, and like condition the soil. Once that soil dries out, the microbial life slows down quite a bit on it. So if you have a water source, and you're not wasting it, it doesn't hurt to periodically water pots where you're not even growing anything in it, because you're actually growing fungus and bacteria and nematodes and all sorts of stuff. There's some grubs in there too, by the way. They're going to float to the surface. I'm going to pick them out and toss them off into the sun to die a horrible death, because I hate grubs. Now, it's a little later, and the pot's dried out a bit and flattened out. This whole area is on a slope, but this bed is completely level, and when I water it later, the water will flow out across evenly with it. There won't be any wet spots or dry spots, and it's level in each direction. So that's pretty much it for the video. This is my first YouTube video, I think, at least the first one with my clothes on. If you liked the video, I think YouTube has a subscribe button and like a like button and buttons like that that you can click on. If I do get some response out of this, I'll consider making some more for some of the other hobbies that I have. I got some weird ones. And I hope this is informative and encourages you to grow fungus. You should grow fungus all over, except maybe in the refrigerator. I got fungus in mine. Anyways, any questions, anything like that, post them down below. I'll try and answer them. And good luck, good gardening, good shrooming.